Welcome everyone to the Crime Pays panel discussion. My name is Jim Robbins and I'm the introducer today. The moderator today is Robert Stubblefield. Robert teaches in the English department at the University of Montana. He has published fiction and personal essays in Dreamers and Desperados, contemporary short fiction of the American West, Hayden's Ferry Review, Left Bank, Open Space, and High Desert Journal, among others. Also, his story, Preserves, was published in Best American Stories of the West. And here's Mr. Stubblefield.
Thank you, Jim. Can everybody hear okay back there? Is this on and working okay? I have just two brief announcements to make before we start. The first is I'd like to bring to your attention the writer's tribute to James Crumley, which will begin at 4 o'clock right across the street at the Wilma. And I imagine there will be significant crossover interest from this audience for the tribute to Jim. So I encourage you to attend that. And also, Alifair Burke is unfortunately unable to be with us today due to the death of her grandmother. And I'd like to extend our condolences and good thoughts to Alifair and her family. So Crime Pays. It's our pleasure and privilege to have four novelists with us here today who indeed do make crime pay, especially for their readers. In the work of Craig Johnson, Keir, Graff, Peter Bowen, and Neil McMahon, we are transported to Chicago, Tulsa, the mountain valleys and plains of Montana and Wyoming, vivid cityscapes and landscapes. And we're provided convincing, compelling characters dancing and darting through moments of grace and life-altering troubles. I'd like to just briefly introduce each of our panelists to you, and then we'll maybe hear a few words from them, and we'll probably go straight into discussion and question and answer after that, because I know they want to hear what you have to say and you want to hear what they have to say. I'll start with Craig. Craig Johnson has received both critical and popular praise for his novels The Cold Dish, Death Without Company, Kindness Goes Unpunished, and Another Man's Moccasins. Craig's novels have been book sense selections by the Independent Booksellers Association and killer picks by the Independent Mystery Booksellers Association. The Cold Dish was a Dillis Award finalist and was a book sense paperback summer pick for 2006. It will be translated into French in 2009. Death Without Company was selected by Booklist as one of the top 10 mysteries of 2006, won the Wyoming Historical Society's Fiction Book of the Year, and was a finalist for the Mountains and Plains Booksellers Association Book of the Year. The short story, Old Indian Trick, won the Tony Hillerman Mystery Short Story Award and appeared in Cowboys and Indians magazines. Sorry about that. Another Man's Moccasins was released by Viking in June. It's the fourth book in the Walt Longmire series. Of the Walt Longmire series, the New York Times says the characters talk straight from the hip, and the Wyoming landscape is its own kind of eloquence. Craig lives with his wife Judy in Ucross, Wyoming, population 25. So I guess 23 today, right, Craig?
Crown jewel of the UCLA area. Ucross, Claremont, Leiter, and Arvada.
Next to Craig is Neil McMahon. Neil was a Stegner Fellow at Stanford and is the author of 5 novels, most recently Lone Creek and Dead Silver. He is also a carpenter in Missoula, where his wife Kim coordinates the Montana Festival of the Book, which I think you probably heard of. Of Lone Creek, James Crumley wrote a lovely novel, smart and exciting, set in a landscape that throbs with beauty. Of Dead Silver, John Jackson says, the most gratifying read I've had in a year. It's the characters, wise, honest Hugh, Madburn, the taciturn Blackfeet sage, as endearing and fearsome as any writer has ever imagined, and smart, handsome, and impossible to handle women. It takes a considerable hero just to survive the presence of these women. A hell of a read. On Neil's left, we have Keir Graff. Keir was born and raised here in Missoula and is a proud graduate of Hellgate High, class of 1987. That's the only thing that he insisted I mention in this introduction.
Move on.
Keir was born and raised here in Missoula and is a proud graduate of Hellgate High.
And who else can say that?
He's also the author of the novels My Fellow Americans and One Nation Under God. He's published short stories in the Chicago Reader, the Portland Review, and Time Out Chicago, among other places. His screenplay, Driving a Bargain, based on his play of the same name, is in pre-production. Keir is the senior editor of Booklist Online. Of One Nation Under God, Library Journal says, perfectly paced and leavened by touches of humor, gripping from start to finish. Highly recommended. Keir lives in Chicago with his wife and 2 sons. To Keir's left is Peter Bowen, a Montanan who writes of the West. Cowboy, hunting and fishing guide, folk singer, poet and essayist and novelist. He's written the Yellowstone Kelly historical novels and humor columns and essays on blood sports as Coyote Jack. He's also written the Gabrielle Dupre mysteries, in part because the Métis are a great people, a wonderful people, and not many Americans know anything about them. Peter contributed this when I asked him for a bio. Born oddly enough some time ago and never seemed to change much. Obscure scribblers of novels, probably justifiably so. Not much on explaining my work, since it surely ought to. Briefly attended courses in writing at the University of Montana, but left before any lasting damage was done. Was that the University of Montana?
Take your pick.
Writing in the New York Times Book Review, Jonas Agee says, Bowen has taken the anti-hero of Hemingway and Hammett and brought him up to date. Bowen brings many worlds together and hones the language to create a fresh, memorable character and a profound vision. So I'd just like for each of the panelists to contribute briefly any words that they might have, and then we'll hear from you with any questions, comments you might have. So, Craig, do you have anything you want to open with?
Well, let's see. The first thing I thought of was an instance that happened here about a couple months ago. I was coming back from a library event in Meeteetse, in the western part of Wyoming. Like I said, population about 351, like that, and I was on my way back, and they said, I said, I'm going to cut across 20, like that there in the Otto Basin area. And I mean, Wyoming is really unpopulated. This is the most unpopulated area of Wyoming, for gosh sake. So I'm on my way back through there, like that, and they said, well, be careful, because the HPs are pretty bad in that section, like that, and so they'll get you if you're going too fast. Like that. You guys know what I'm talking about. Whenever you get out on the road for about 40 minutes and you haven't seen another car, your foot just kind of automatically starts going down a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further. And so I go popping over this hill, like, and for the first time in 40 minutes, I actually saw another car. And I was like, wow, look, another car. So I'm preparing to do the wave, the 2-finger wave, like, as they come over the top of the hill. And then imagine my surprise when the light bar came on that car. And so, I went ahead and pulled over because I'd been a police officer, and so I knew the drill. So I went ahead and pull over, like, this guy, like, swings this black Dodge Charger around, pulls up behind me, and gets out, and he's about 30 years old, a young guy. I didn't used to call guys who were 30 young, but now I do. And he gets out of the car, and he comes up, like, and he walks up, and he says, license, registration. I get it out, and I hand it to him, like, and he takes a look at it, and he says, you know why I pulled you over? Like, and I said, yeah, I think I was about 8 over. I'm kind of hedging a little bit and trying to save myself, and there's some points here. And he goes, no, you're about 17 over. And I was like, ooh, there goes the negotiation factor of this conversation. Like, I look at him, he looks at me, like, and he looks at my driver's license, he looks at me, like, he looks at my driver's license again, he looks at me, he goes, I read your books, Mr. Johnson. And he said it just like that. And I look over at my wife, who's sitting next to me, like that, and I go, this could go either way. And he goes, no, he says, I used to be a cop in Indianapolis, like, and he says, now you were a cop before too, yeah? Like, and so we have this wonderful conversation that goes on for about 3 or 4 minutes. And throughout this entire conversation, I'm fully aware that he is still holding my license and registration. So he gets to the end of the conversation, we get a little lull in the conversation, and he goes, well, I'll be back in just a minute. Like, he turns around, he walks away. Well, those of you who know my little redheaded wife, like, he gets maybe 2 steps away from the window whenever she goes, well, that was a nice conversation. He'd have to be a real dick to give you a ticket now. I'm thinking, honey, couldn't you have waited until he got in the cruiser before you said that? Like that, And so we're sitting there waiting, I'm thinking, all right, well, I haven't got a ticket in like about 18 years, so I might as well get one now. So we're sitting there waiting about 5 or 10 minutes. He comes back up, and he hands me my license and my registration. And he also hands me the blue warning ticket. And he hands it to me and I'll never forget what he said. It was like the finest words I'll ever hear in any awards ceremony or anything. He looks at me, he goes, "We wish you'd slow down a little, Mr. Johnson. We'd like to get some more books out of you." And I was like, "You bet." You betcha, no problem at all. And so when I got back home, I send out this thing called the Post-it. It's just a newsletter that I send out every month. And so I get back home. I think I'll fire this thing off as a short, story. I just always send out short stories. So I write this thing up. Get ready to fire it out. But my wife takes a look at it. She's my first editor always. So she takes a look at it and she says, "Are you sure you want to send this out?" And I said, "Well, why?" And she says, "Well, he's only been a highway patrolman for about a year now. He's kind of fresh on the job like that. And to my judgment here." Law enforcement groups that have commandants really don't have a really good sense of humor. And so she said, "Are you sure you want to get him into trouble like that by saying that he gave you a warning ticket? It might seem like a little bit of nepotism going on there." And I said, "Oh, well, okay, I'll just throw that out and I'll write something else." She goes, "Well, no, put like an anti-Hollywood ending on it, so that he gives you the ticket in the end, and then that way you won't get him into trouble." And I was like, "Oh, okay, great." So I rewrite the thing. I figure that's what I do. I write fiction, So I changed the ending, and have him give me the ticket in the end, right? Okay, so then I fire this thing off to all over the world. Doesn't every cop in America write me back and go, "What a dick." I cannot believe that young pup gave you a ticket. If he knew how much good you were doing for law enforcement, he wouldn't have given you that ticket. I'm writing back the Attorney General for the state of Wyoming. "He didn't give me the ticket. He didn't give me the ticket." So that's just to go to show you that, my little modicum of celebrity is not as great as it's supposed to be. There it is.
There's no way I can touch that.
Yeah, tell him. Yeah, you can. Tell him the last time I came up here and we were supposed to be here for a reading.
We'll talk about that in the morning. The first thing that comes into my mind is that some years ago I was at a convention, and I think there were 4 of us who had to speak at a breakfast meeting, other writers and booksellers and so on and so forth. And without having any, can y'all hear? Can y'all hear this? Is that okay? Okay. I had no idea, who the other people were, what was going on, but I had the good luck, as it turned out, to be the first one to give my, little 3-minute wrap up there. Because the next speaker to come up was Tim Dorsey. I don't know if you all know the name. He writes these Florida novels they're very funny and so on. Tim got up, and he had the whole room almost literally rolling in the aisles within, 30 seconds. And I sat back and thought, Jesus, am I glad that I don't have to follow that. Anyway, that's kind of...
All right, then I have to tell a story real quick. This is the 30-second Reader's Digest version. I came up for my last reading on the last tour, and we went out for a little drink. And so when we came back out, we couldn't find Neil's truck. And we were a little late for our reading like that. But, that was my fault, though. I didn't recognize his truck was the problem.
A 1968 GMC Suburban, really.
Tough to look.
I was just trying to keep up a fine old Missoula tradition of getting hammered at my own reading. Jim Crumley would have been disgusted if I walked in the door sober. So anyway.
He wouldn't have walked.
Well, I was delighted to be asked to come back here for the Festival of the Book, and especially to be on this panel. And but at first, everybody wants to come back to their hometown, right? As the published author, and so here's my chance. But then I got the details, and I found out that I was on the Crime Pays panel, and I thought, well, that's kind of funny because my first book was sort of a crime novel. It's a noir about an English teacher who kind of tries to solve a crime. And my last 2 books are kind of, people have called them paranoid thrillers. They're political fiction. And I thought, well, yeah, I guess I do write about politics. And in Chicago, certainly, I've been living in Chicago since 1995. It's kind of a tradition, when a politician leaves office, we play small wagers on whether they're going to end up behind bars or not. Frequently they do. So I guess I kind of feel like I might actually fit here on the Crime Pays panel after all. I got no funny anecdotes.
It's the vote early, vote often stay.
Yeah.
I'll be very brief. I read once in Livingston, and this beautifully dressed woman, I would say about 60, walked up to me after the reading and said, "I've read all of your books. Where exactly is that mountain range?" And I said, "I don't have any idea." And she said, "I thought not."
It's also always nice when people walk up to you and they look at you and say, "I've read your work."
Yep.
And then that's it.
I didn't get off that lightly.
Okay, thanks, guys. Maybe we'll just start by seeing if you have any questions for each other. If that raised any questions between you, and then we'll go out to the audience and see what questions you might have. I have a few, but I'd probably rather give you the opportunity to start.
Who's your agent?
I can either confirm or deny.
Okay, what about the audience? What questions do you have for either? Yeah.
I suspect I'm not the only one in the room who would like to ask Peter Bowen if we're ever going to hear more from Dupree.
Oh, thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay, because this way I can see you. As it happens with many writers, I got into a knockdown, drag-out, eye-gouging, thumb-biting fight with my publisher, the swine.
That's a technical term.
And, after one does this, then you have to get a lawyer. And then it takes a very long time. And I finally got all the rights back to my books. And there are two new Duprees written and about half of two more. And they're, I hope, going to be purchased fairly soon. It's been at a publisher in New York now for a year. And now you know absolutely as much as I do.
You know the old line about writers are like mushrooms, publishers, they feed us, keep us in the dark.
Well, I have a question for all of you here on the panel. It seems like oftentimes in contemporary fiction, the protagonists are kind of paralyzed by self-doubt, if not outright self-loathing, and they're hesitant to act in almost any fashion. And I think in your books, not to generalize, but the protagonists possess maybe a certain moral certitude that it both gets them into trouble and out of trouble, and they oftentimes encounter other people that have the same certitude but may lack the moral portion of that. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and to see if that character informs the plot or the plot informs the character for you.
We're looking at you.
I'll jump down the line here.
Let's start with Peter and move this
Sure, you're starting with me?
Yeah,
You're farthest
right.
away from me, yeah.
Plot informs the character, character informs the plot. Bob, with apologies. That's why I left the writing program.
I believe every part of that except the apologies.
What about the first part of your question, though, about moral certitude?
Well, I can speak only for myself and this character. For me, I make up the people, if you will. They occur to me, and then the story follows that. Other people might do it another way. I'm the least intellectual writer I know, people come up and ask me what this means, and I just always say the same thing. I don't know. Or they'll have some theory about this, that, or the other, and I say, I don't know. So that's probably not very helpful, but I truly don't know. It only takes me about 2 weeks to write a depraved mystery. All the depraved mysteries that were published are first drafts. I just write them. And writers have a lot of different ways of working. So, am I talking around the question or answering it? I also got kind of weary about reading about detectives in between AA meetings solving crimes. And I thought something more robust, like some guy roaring around Montana at 120 miles an hour, drunk most of the time, probably would be useful.
I think, I guess I think my characters don't actually have that moral certitude. And in my two most recent novels, I'm really, what I'm trying to do with them is, they're political novels. I'm trying to explore world events through the lens of characters people that I guess, I'm trying to explore the events through people I can understand. And I'm trying to, I guess I write more, if we're talking about this in terms of being a crime fiction panel, I write more about victims probably than people who solve crimes or fix things. My book, My Fellow Americans, is about an American citizen who's a victim of extraordinary rendition. And my newer book, One Nation Under God, is about kind of a lost young 20-something who gets involved with a really weird, very, very conservative big box church, and it ends up politicking for a candidate he doesn't really know anything about. He's looking for a place to belong. And I think that I use writing as a way to explore issues and explore my feelings about issues. And so I really try not to write with a sense of moral certitude. And hopefully, this sounds so insanely corny to say, but you really, it's like you're hoping for a dialogue with the reader. I'm hoping that my books are part of a conversation, and I'm hoping to hear back from people. And it's just a process for me of just working through things. I do have really strong political convictions, but at the same time, I think that it's, if you view the world in black and white, then you probably shouldn't be writing novels.
Well, I think Seth encounters a certain degree of moral certitude exactly, and sees how dangerous that can be.
Yeah, you're right. Maybe it's what happens when somebody runs up against moral certitude. Yeah.
Well, I'll speak briefly about my last two novels, Lone Creek and Dead Silver. Lone Creek in particular is the first of the two. It's the first one set in Montana. And the main character is not a cop or detective or lawyer or anything like that. It's so I had to do a lot of thinking about how am I gonna, this is not a guy who is kind of in the course of his life exposed to crime very often. He's a construction worker. And he doesn't have a great deal of moral certitude. He just doesn't really have enough imagination to commit crimes or anything like that. And then he gets into a situation where, sort of through no fault of his own, it's kind of a little bit his fault, he gets this serious trouble. He sees something he shouldn't, and all of a sudden things start going very bad for him, and he realizes he's up against this, very powerful individual with resources that's out to take him down. And then what he has to learn is how to become radically, not just immoral, but, he's got to learn how to defend himself and work in that world. And that became to me, which happens largely through the offices of his partner, a Blackfeet Indian named Madbird, who knows real well how to operate, in that fringe world and so on. Madbird becomes kind of his mentor through this. But that's one of the aspects of the book, and kind of like Peter said, I didn't start out trying to do that. It just happened by itself. But it is one of the aspects that I ended up being most satisfied with, I guess, is the fact that through the book, Hugh starts out as this basically pretty decent guy, and by the end of it, he's still a decent guy by his standards, but he's killed somebody and hidden the body and helped kill somebody else, and, on and on and on down the line, and, his world has changed.
My protagonist is a sheriff, And I guess the best way I ever heard it described was there was a desk sergeant that I had for a training officer one time, and he said, when everybody's running this way, your job is to run that way. And I think that, that was one of the indications, like that I think with the character. I mean, my least favorite type of characters are the 6'2", twisted steel and sex appeal. The ones that can kill any man with a number 2 Ticonderoga pencil and every woman wants them and all that. I have enough problems when I get up in the morning and look at myself. I don't need to read about that crap, So, my protagonist is very far from perfect like that, but nonetheless, like that, I think one of the main reasons why he does, what he does and why he is a sheriff in this, this rural county of Wyoming along the Bighorn Mountains is because he cares about the people that are in that community. He cares about them. They're his neighbors, they're his friends, his family, like that he feels very strongly that there's a certain amount of responsibility that goes along with looking after those people like that and trying to help them in situations where they sometimes find themselves. And, and a lot like what we're talking about here is that, it's the old T.S. Eliot quote that all cats is gray in the dark. I mean, you kind of have to remember, that it's not as simple as the old black and white hats. I mean, everybody's wearing a gray hat, it seems like, whenever you're looking at books. In the mystery genre right now, we kind of benefit from the fact that you guys are really sophisticated readers. You basically come to the genre with the same expectations that you have for literary fiction, for anything else like that. I mean, you're still coming in here looking for fully developed characters, arc of storyline, history, humor, all of those things like it. And one of the things that does is it kind of like raises the bar a little bit for the genre, which is kind of nice, which makes it a little bit more interesting to write in. And the fact that, that mystery thriller is now 17% of the 49% of fiction writing nowadays that's being sold. I mean, we just overtook romance writing, which I take as a great benefit to our culture. But don't say that in any other romance panels, okay? And don't quote me, all right? But to me, that's something that I think that people are looking for: a beginning, a middle, and an end. They're looking for a story that goes along with these things. They want all of those aspects of literary fiction, but they also want to damn well know who done it by the time they get to the end too. And to me, that just kind of raises the bar, and I think makes it a lot more enjoyable to write within the genre, I think. So.
I would like to know your favorite bad guys or hard cases and why you like them. It could be real or fiction.
Starting back on this end again? We're going to start in the middle. Let's start in the middle. Come on.
No, it's coming back this way.
You know what? The interesting thing about that is that I think that you got to always look at your books and say to yourself, if you were writing this book first person, from the bad guy's point of view, he'd be the hero. And I think that you can get into a lot of dangerous spots by giving those great big rubber stamps of good guys and bad guys. I mean, there are a lot of books that I approach, that I know my response to them is not, exactly maybe the way that they should be. I think Moby Dick is one of the funniest books ever written. And Captain Ahab certainly has a lot of problems, along that same route like that. But nonetheless, I mean, you've got to look at it and say, they would be the protagonist of their books. Everything that they do would be the right thing to do, and they would have a perfectly logical and reasonable reason for what it is that they do. And I think that the more you write your books with the sense of understanding why the bad people do the bad things, supposedly bad things that they do, the more interesting your books are. For me, I would hope that there's going to be a moment, whenever you're reading my books, where you're reading about the antagonist that's in the piece, where you're going to be reading that book and you're going to say, you know what, I can see why they would do that. I can see why it is that they would respond the way that they did. And, and that just opens up another can of worms, which I'll hand off to Neil now.
The first, I'm searching my mind and not finding much, which is not surprising. But the first thing that comes to my mind there is, not to be blowing too much smoke about Jim Crumley, but his detective, C.W. Shagru and Milo Dragovich. He has that line himself about, the two are similar in some ways, and somebody asked him, well, how do we tell the two apart? Crumley said, if you walked up to Milo, he'd help you out. You walked up to Shagru, he'd shoot you in the foot. But I think, and other hard-boiled guys like that, Chandler's Philip Marlowe, I think, is one of my favorites. I know you're asking more about villains, maybe, and I'm blanking on that one, sorry. I like them all. I like the villains. Iago. Iago's the best bad guy.
Well, and there's that old Lakota phrase that you're only as strong as your enemies. I mean, that's the other great thing about it is that you've really got to make those antagonists strong. They've got to be, powerful.
Well, I want to be real high tone and say Satan in Milton. But really, I talked about a classic example of a bad guy who you start to understand his motivation. I hate to talk about TV when we're at a book festival, but I think some of the best bad guys that I've seen recently are in The Wire. They've got characters who are doing despicable things that you feel should be locked in jail, and you care about them, you care about their struggles, you understand why they're doing what they're doing, you understand the maybe kind of limited perspective or the limited scope of opportunities that has caused them to be, become a drug dealer or something like that. And it was funny, Greg and I were just at VoucherCon in Baltimore 2 weeks ago, which is a great mystery convention, and there was a panel. It was basically a bunch of crime writers talking about how much they love The Wire. But I think that show has really set it's breaking new ground for TV for sure. But I hate to say it, but it's definitely inspired me in my own writing to help remember. I mean, we've all learned these things on the way. Every character is the hero of his own story. But sometimes you got to see a great illustration of that to be reminded of how much effort you need to put into it.
Are we down to me?
We're down to you.
Okay, no theories. I'll tell you a story from my own life about a man who was, shall we say, an unindicted criminal. He drove a lot of law enforcement people absolutely crazy. He was never arrested, never indicted. One time he was the largest landowner in Montana. His name was Benny Binion, and he founded the Golden Horseshoe Casinos in Nevada. Before that, he was the crime kingpin of Dallas. And I ended up working for him on his ranch in New Mexico briefly, and one day I was told to take a pickup truck and this here briefcase and drive it to Las Vegas and take it to this address. Okay, so I did all that. I thought the point of the exercise was that, can this kid drive all the way there without opening it? So I take it there, I hand it over, the guy that takes it says, go up to the restaurant, get something to eat, Benny wants you to come back. And so I drive all night, I go all the way back to New Mexico, and I go to work, and Benny walks out to the corral I'm working in, and he leans over it, and he says, come here. And I went over and he said, here's $500. I said, what's this for? He said, you're too smart to be a crook, you're fired. I really liked it.
Is that Ted Binion's father?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
Great family tradition there.
Craig, you mentioned the word community in one of your responses, and it seems to me that that's something that is at work in all of your novels, is that you're able to create these fully realized communities, these worlds for your characters. So, I mean, I'm utterly convinced in all of your work of the place that I'm at, and just any tips on how you go about doing that? Any thoughts about that? I mean, they're all based in places that some of us would recognize, but oftentimes when we read a novel, we come away and we haven't felt fully immersed in a community. But how do you achieve that?
You know, Wallace Stegner said the greatest, lie that was ever printed was the disclaimer at the beginning of every novel that says, that these characters are fully fictional and not based off of anybody or any person living or dead or anything. He's absolutely right. And I think that one of the big things is everybody always asks, they always say, well, do you use, I had my first meeting, one of the first big meetings I had back in New York at Viking Penguin was with all these different heads of the departments and stuff. And they had a guy from the legal department, and I made some really horrible remark, and he looked at me and he says, well, yeah, but you didn't use real people in your books, right? And I was like, oh yeah, I did. And he goes, yeah, but you didn't use their names or anything like that. And I was like, oh yeah, I did. Yeah. He was like, about to have a heart attack. And he says, you got to go back and you got to change all those because people are will have nuisance suits and a lot of problems. You got to go back and you got to change all of these. And so I get back, and I'm sitting there at the ranch, and I'm thinking, this is dumb. And I really can't think of other names for these characters, because they are who they are, And so, I just called, in the old Western tradition, I just called everybody up on the phone and I said, you're not going to sue me, right? Because I used you on page 167. You didn't kill anybody or anything like that, so you don't have to worry, but I went and used your name and where you live. Is that okay? And, to a person, every single one of them said, yeah, no problem. Don't worry about it. I'm going to buy about 30 copies and give them to everybody I know. Show them how famous I am, And, not a single person. And then, what happened was there were a few people I forgot, And so there was a rancher friend of mine who lived down the road, from me, and his wife called and said, we want you to come down, and Cleve's got a book. We want you to sign it for his birthday. And I'm on my way down there in the Jeep, and I'm thinking to myself, oh crap, he's on page 163. And I'm thinking, I haven't told him or anything like that. And I thought, oh man, maybe he's not going to like this, or So I get there like that, and of course, I'm sitting there signing his book, and I said, so, you looking forward to reading it? He goes, yeah, I already read it. And I was like, did you like it? He goes, yeah, if I get to come back in another book. He's already renegotiating his contract here. But, I think that, a lot of times, people always ask, they always say, was this based off of somebody you know? And in Wyoming, we only have 535,000 people. So if I mention somebody up in Gillette, they know them down in Evanston, for God's sake. So, the big trick there is very rarely do you actually find somebody who is, to a T perfect, for the characterization that you want to bring across. Because the characters basically are telling the story that you're trying to tell. A lot of times, what you do is you find yourself doing a kind of a Dr. Frankenstein kind of thing. You take little bits and pieces of different people that you know, and you take them and you put them into these different characters like that. And there's a fellow sitting out here, Michael Rissman, like that, who I met actually at the first Montana Book Festival that I came and did here about 3 years ago. And I had this one character like that who was this surgeon like that in the third book, and he was a specialist on brain activity like that, and a lot of that's electrical impulses like that. And one of the things I noticed about Michael was that when he talked to you, he didn't look you in the face; he would look at your shoulder when he talked to you. And so I utilized that as that that one telling that tell for that one character. And I thought, and I even used his name, Rissman, Dr. Rissman, and all this like that. And so, of course, the first time I came back up to Helena like that, I ran into Michael. Michael goes, "Do I really look at your shoulder when I talk to you?" So, he's got commentary now.
I can't look this fast. So, how this looks from the other side is, Craig did call me beforehand and tell me that he wanted to use me in the book. And that's all he told me, and nobody's ever used me in a book before. So I said, yeah, sure. So I get it on the advanced reader's copy of this thing. And I'm wondering what tell he's going to use or how I'm going to recognize myself in this book that's in Philadelphia. So I'm reading along and saying, am I this character, am I that character? I come to the chapter and it says, this doctor walked off the elevator and Walt reads his name tag and his name tag said Dr. Rissman. And I said, I bet you that's me.
So if I ever do it to any of you, that's your first indication right there.
But I'd say to date, maybe that technique has worked out a little better for you, Craig, than it did for Dr. Frankenstein.
Michael hasn't led the people of Missoula with torches after me just yet. So.
I think how happy your mother will be, Michael. You're finally a doctor.
That's a brilliant technique, though, using people's actual names. My first book, it was, like a lot of people's first book, it was set kind of slavishly in the real world that I had experienced, and I beat myself up trying to change all the names, and if I would have known that everyone was going to buy 30 copies, their own name in it, I should have just kept them the same. I was doing these clever things, so look a little similar.
Good point.
Do you want to talk about the community thing?
Well, the only thing I have to add there is, I think in terms of technique, when I'm trying to bring a place, to life or get it fixed in the reader's mind, to try to pick particular specific details, real concrete details, and only a few of them. I'm not a descriptive writer. It's, pulling teeth for me and so on. And try to keep that blended with the action and so on, so that it's never like long paragraphs and so on and so forth, but enough so that that you can picture this place with the 2 or 3 things that are there, and similarly in physically describing people. You don't want to go through the whole, so-and-so was 5'11", blonde hair, or 180 pounds, da-da-da-da. You want to pick 1, 2, maybe 3 things, kind of like the looking at the shoulder deal, that really fix that individual in the reader's mind. And then you don't have to do it again, usually, at least if it's done right. But for me, that's all, it's a balancing act of how little of that I can do and get away with it. And what I really want to do is keep that story going, keep the action going.
Yeah, I think when that's done well, we see the character, we make our own character, provided those details rather than reading it like an APB. Sometimes you can arrest the characters, but you wouldn't know them.
Yeah, Ron Carlson once said, he said, not inventory, but actuality. What's the actuality of it, not lists.
I'm moving away myself from setting things in actual locations. I'm kind of starting my new book set in Tulsa, and I've only been through Tulsa once. I just kind of had an idea of Tulsa and the Tulsa I wanted to write about. But I do think I agree with you. It's just the telling detail that you're looking for, and I was trying to think about a way to describe the place where my protagonist Seth lives, and I thought he lives in an apartment building. It's a converted motel, and the detail that really struck home for me was that his neighbors come in late, they come in drunk, they put on a DVD and then fall asleep during it. And all night long, he can hear that little cycling. When there's on the menu of a DVD, they do 30 seconds of soundtrack and they repeat it over and over. And that's what he can hear because they watch horror movies. So he hears like a crash of thunder, a scream, and then like a swell of music all night long. And I just thought, for some reason, okay, that now I know where he lives. And I think it doesn't have anything to do with Tulsa per se, but it has to do with it lets you know what kind of class he is. He's broke. He lives in a bad neighborhood, and I think anybody can relate to that detail, or at least I hope they can.
Is it my turn now?
It's your turn.
Okay.
Pay attention.
Well, amidst all the highfalutin, I'll just tell you a story about a sense of place. I grew up in Montana, then I went back to the None Too Mystic East to go to school, which I did for a very long time, and then I left there and I drove back here, and I'd been driving for about 20 hours, and I ended up in this little bar in this little town that I will not name in the middle of the afternoon. And can you all hear me? I'm not next to a microphone. I'm in this little bar, and there are 3 splendid examples of crusty old Western farthood buried up to the bar there. And one of them says, "You know that bunch of hippies that's renting the old Smith place? They're down there making toad food." Toad food? Yeah, they make it out of soybeans. Jesus Christ, are you telling me the toads is on welfare? I was home.
That may fall under the stuff you can't make up. Questions from the audience? Yeah.
Speaking about community and sense of place and so on, do you, I guess because you don't do yours in the West, setting crime novels in the West, is that more difficult in terms of readership, acceptance, and sales, and all that, or is it just set it in the West because that's where you're from?
That's my mistake. I need to be writing about New York City.
I think obviously there are mechanical difficulties. I mean, there's the next book I've got coming out, like that. Walt, is the sheriff. Like that. One of the things I did was I was over in Arvada on the Powder River and sitting there, a Sunday afternoon. And I looked around at everybody and I said, "Does anybody know who the sheriff is over in Johnson County?" And the closest they got was 50 years ago, who the sheriff was. And so I thought, oh, well, this is an opportunity. Then maybe I might be able to get away with this, having Walt, go into another county, because I actually, kind of like. I'm sensitive to jurisdictional applications, like as far as law enforcement, because where I worked like that, and what I found out was I was actually sitting there in one sheriff's office, and he was calling over to Campbell County, and he said, "Do you mind if I come over there and take a look around?" My ears kind of perked up because I thought, well, I want to see how this is responded to. And the other sheriff said, "I'll pay for your gas." And so, and what happened was I was over in this bar in Arvada, and I looked around and I said, "Does anybody know?" And nobody knew. And so I thought, well, I'll write this book. It's kind of like a village mystery, where this, somebody gets killed, and somebody, a stranger shows up, to try and ask some questions, runs into a lot of difficulty like that. But one of the things that happens is, of course, I think that Walt says, like by the third chapter, he says, "I should have understood the inherent difficulties of going undercover in a town of 40. There's a part where he's at an auction, and the auctioneer goes, "Oh, well, we must have some problems out here tonight." And Walt's like this, But, yeah, there are going to be certain problems that go along with it, but just like anything else, I'm sure that, you guys back me up, that there are also wonderful things, that you can bring to it, too, like that. And, anytime you're writing about a specific place, like that, it's like the old Studs Terkel remark, nothing ever happened nowhere, if you really got to be specific about a place, like that, the wonderful thing is that, you get emails from people that say, "I live in southern Florida and I came through the high plains one time back in 1963 in the back of my parents' Plymouth station wagon, and I always remembered it. I never made it back, but I always remembered it," like that. And then you're able to invoke that in people and let them, see that place again, like that, which is a kind of a wonderful thing to be able to do with genre literature. So.
Look at me.
Sure, why not?
There's a lot of cachet to the west, Montana, Wyoming, one of the reasons that we're able to do what we do and so on. But I do think it's true that if you really want to hit it big time, by and large, you're probably better off right in New York City or DC or LA. That's, Burke, of course, has done real well. But still, I think the vast majority, just in terms of the numbers and sales and so on, you're going to look at guys like Dennis Lehane and George Pelicanos and James Patterson and, down that line. And most of those things are set in the big urban cities, and they involve, the other part of it is that I would say the vast majority involve money, and people are fascinated with the rich, famous, elite, all of that sort of stuff. And I think that probably most of the, statistically, is going to be in that neighborhood there. But there's a huge fascination with the West. C.J. Box is another guy who's done stuff. And,
Fellow that you probably never heard of, Tony Hillerman.
so we do our best to exploit it, with the middling success.
I think you're right that it has a lot to, people are more fascinated with lifestyles of rich and famous than anything, and a lot of the best-selling stuff tends to be set in the lives of privileged people and wealthy people. But I think C.J. Box is a great person to bring up because, he's became a New York Times best-selling author writing about Wyoming and is a very specific sense of place. But what's interesting is now he has two publishers, and he's doing standalone thrillers on one side, and then he's continuing his Joe Pickett series. And it seems like his new publisher is really pushing him to kind of get away from the fish and game kind of thing that won him all these fans. And his first standalone was set in North Idaho and really had a strong kind of a C.J. Box feeling. And then his new book, which I've read, is set in like kind of suburban Denver. And I've noticed they give him two different publicity photos. On the Pickett novels, he's got his cowboy hat, and then on the standalones, he's wearing a leather jacket and no hat. And I'm not trying to knock him. I think he's a phenomenal writer. I'm a big fan. But I think that it shows a lot of pressure maybe from the publisher to say like, well, this guy's done really well with this Western thing, but we might be a little limited here. We might be able to, if we can kind of take off the cowboy hat and reposition you a little bit, we might be able to make you, enormous. And so I don't know where that's headed, but I think it does speak to there are benefits and to writing about the West and some dangers as well.
And if you really, really want to make some money, write something titled "Thinner Thighs for Your Cat."
And then a companion one for dog people, too. You don't want to alienate your dog.
Be a whole series.
Yeah. Any companion animal.
I think one conflict that you do have inherent when you write about the West, particularly Montana, Wyoming, that region. It's kind of the contrast between what people call the New West and the Old West. And I mean, we see that, you know, in some ways it's a class conflict, it's a lifestyle conflict.
Goes back to Shane. You know, think about,
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
no, that's all I was gonna say.
Yeah.
Think about the story of Shane, you know, and that's exactly what, you know, the real deal is, and I'm sure before that.
Other questions from the audience? Yeah, back there.
I don't come from a literary background, so this is going to be a little bit general, and if you want to take it in a different direction, it's fine. But I'm wondering whether you all think that the form informs your content, and if you do, I was wondering if you could give a specific example of how the form you write in informs specifically the moral content of your novels and books.
Did you say you don't come from a literary background?
He's going undercover.
You guys take this one.
I think that's a perfect one for Peter, actually.
Right in there.
And I need a cigarette.
Chase him out of here.
Wimp.
You know what? Whenever anybody used to say, you know, what people would ask, they say, "Well, what do you write?" Like, and I used to always, you know, have this kind of like, you know, a little bit of like embarrassed kind of quality to my voice. I would always say, "Well, I write murder mysteries," and my wife, you know, just about wailed the living daylights out of me one day like that, and she said, "It's life and death. The stakes don't get any higher than that." You know, and I think that that's, you know, in a lot of ways, you know, as far as the dramatic conflict, you know, of what it is that's the essence, you know, the pith and the marrow of what it is that we write about, like that you are talking about life and death. And in some ways, like that kind of like heightens, you know, the storytelling to just a little bit, you know, higher level. And I think that that's one of the things that's kind of nice to be able to shoot for as far as the storylines are concerned. So I'm always aware, you know, that when I'm writing a book, like that it is, you know, I'm dealing with people's lives here. You know, and that, you know, it was kind of nice like that because the remark, you know, that you made a little bit earlier as far as with crime literature, it's also like the rock that hits the water. I mean, those ripples kind of go out in all directions and they hit everybody. I mean, that kind of a crime, it doesn't just have an effect on the victim, it has an effect on everyone that has anything involved with it, and the community itself and the people that investigate it all the way across the board. And so for me, that's kind of one of the enjoyable factors of the genre, I have to say.
I do think that the form, particularly, you know, fiction, of course, I mean, you got everything from War and Peace, or, you know, these huge, long novels, some of which are perhaps not quite of that caliber, that are very different kinds of reads and very different pacing. But when you get more into crime and thriller stuff, mysteries, detective stories, the form, I would say the vast majority of the time is going to be, it's going to be a comparatively short novel, you know, 300 to 400 pages, and it's going to start, you know, kind of with a bang of some kind, and the writer's job usually is to keep jacking the tension up. You know, you jack it up a notch, and then you kind of maybe back off a little bit, go on a plateau, and then you jack it up again, and, you know, it has to culminate in this, you know, climax. You know, it has been suggested that perhaps this is sort of a recapitulation of the sexual act by people who are literary. But I think there's no, you know, again, you can go clear back to Aristotle, the business of drama, and, you know, people, you got to have that thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis, and, you know, the catharsis, and I'm getting all mixed up in my sisses there. There's a reason that those novels are basically, most of them are kind of set up that way. And I think it does, you know, answer some kind of a need in us to, you know, identify with the character, the protagonist or whoever, and go through this, you know, this heightening tension. And then finally, you know, it's all over and you can, you know, wipe the sweat off your brow and say it's only a movie, at least if the writer's done their job right. So I don't know if that helps any, but.
Yeah, I think I mean, I'm alleged to be a thriller writer. I'm not totally sure that's what I do, but I've also been told that it helps sales if that's on the cover. So I may be a thriller writer. But I think, whether it's literary fiction, whether it's crime fiction, and it's getting a lot harder to tell the difference these days. Some of the finest writers working now who could write anything they want are working in what's called genre fiction. And I think it's becoming kind of a less and less helpful designation. But yeah, it just gets back to the primal art of storytelling. I did a lot of playwriting for a while before I got my first books published, and one of the things that taught me about writing, I don't know, I think it might be Lahus Agri's book about writing the dramatic form, is kind of that there's got to be conflict in every line. If characters are talking to each other and they're not in conflict, your story's going to die. And it can be really subtle conflict. Obviously, it's not people shouting at each other, but there's implied conflict, maybe the way they're talking to each other. There's historical conflict. Maybe there's conflict because they're it's as direct as one guy's a cop and he's questioning a criminal. I mean, there's so many different kinds of conflict. But that has taught me some lessons that I brought into my fiction writing, which is just that to keep people interested, you got to have conflict. And you see nonfiction writers today are adopting more and more the techniques of narrative fiction to tell their nonfiction stories because they want to keep people reading. You got to keep them turning pages. I don't know. I guess I'm rambling a little bit here, but I mean, I think ultimately what people are calling genre fiction is one of the best ways to explore moral issues, because in most moral issues there is conflict, and in genre fiction, conflict is more at the forefront of the way you're telling the story, and that's it.
Somebody once asked David Mamet, they said, why are there so many harsh words in your books, or in your plays rather? And he said, you know what, I don't write plays about the happy village.
Yeah.
So, he's back.
I believe we have a question back here, 2 more questions, and then we'll probably wrap up after that, because I want to give the writers time to get out there and sign some books for you. And I know how this works. We have a few questions here, and then everybody will have a question for you when you get out there. But let's take the 2 questions back there in the middle. Yeah.
It was mentioned earlier, I was just wondering if you've all been told what you mean by some of your writing by people who wrote books that have their own ideas.
Would you say that a little louder? I'm sorry.
You know, you said before, people tell you what you're really trying to say with some of your writing. Does that happen to everybody on some of your books?
English professor.
Not twice.
I find it very helpful, actually.
I found out that a lot of high schools were using the cold dish, my first book, for high school students, as far as I think it was, ethnic tolerance and that type of thing. And that just scared the living daylights out of me, I have to admit, because I thought to myself, I don't care if the next generation is screwed up, but I don't want to be responsible for it, But yeah, I mean, you read those like reader's guides at the end of your book, that the publishers put together, with these academes, and you read that stuff, and I remember my wife, she said, "Boy, did you know this? You were this smart? Did you know that?" And I was like, "No, I didn't. No, really." So it's always a little adventure whenever you find that stuff.
There's a wonderful story about Carl Sandburg going back to his beloved Galesburg College. Down memory lane, he's quite aged, he has won all these awards, and he's wandering around the campus before the big dinner that night, and he goes into this darkened lecture hall, and there's a lecture going on the poetry of Carl Sandburg. And he stands in the back listening to the professor bloviate for a while, and finally he says, "No, that's not what I meant at all."
Well, yeah, back there in the green zone.
I didn't attend all this session, but I'm just curious. I had a cousin who lived in Kalispell, whose name was Margaret Scherf, and she wrote a series of at least 10 books. I think they were published by Doubleday, and they were mysteries. And the hero was an Episcopalian rector. Has anybody ever read any of those books? Great. Just curious. It was a long time ago.
Okay. Yeah, one more.
Craig, you just talked about, I'm just curious about, in the West, nobody's ever written a book where the white guy is like rooted in this culture and outstanding. And he's got, and the protagonist is this Indian who's whacked out with a white guy, and he has to always set him on a pathway. Why is it always, it seems like white authors, when they write stuff, it's always the person of the other culture, Spencer or Henry Stanley Bear, or other who's got it together, and it's like strongly rooted in culture.
The only thing I could speak to is the Indian friends that I've got up on the Cheyenne, the Crow Reservation, and they always seem to have their shit a lot better together than I do. And so it kind of, my books kind of reflect that a little bit. And people always ask, I always say, well, like Henry's kind of like this, this sidekick to Walt, and I'm like, no, not really. It's more like Walt is kind of a sidekick to Henry when you get really down to it. So, to me, I don't know. I mean, that's just my experiences. I got a buddy, Marcus Red Thunder, who is just phenomenal. Like his sense of humor and his ideal of what the world is like. When I was doing research on the second book, Death Without Company, I found out that there was a Mennonite church that had actually been up on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, and they ran onto it when they found the old foundation for it. With a pipeline they were putting through. And I remember looking at him like that and saying, Mennonites on the reservation, and I remember, I'll never forget what he said. He looks up and he goes, "It didn't take." That said it all right there. I had a book,
Okay, well, let's thank Craig, Gil, Keir, and Peter for being here, and